everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. And welcome to the last Author Talk of 2024. It's been such a great year, and we're ending the year on a fantastic note with New York Times bestselling author Laura Dave here to chat with us about her newest book, The Night We Lost Him. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Brandon. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to get started. I do have a little bit of housekeeping information to give everybody so they know how to ask questions and things like that. So I do want to remind everybody that the Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 450 library systems across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand, with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. And of course, I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator, in conversation with each of the amazing authors that we speak with throughout the series. I know everyone's ready to get started. Like I said, we have compiled some pre-submitted questions, so thank you for doing that, but you can continue to ask questions throughout the entirety of the talk, and we encourage you to do so. You can do that by looking just below the live stream video. You'll see the questions tab, and you click that and you submit your question there. If you're already in full screen view, you might need to minimize to see those tabs under the live stream video. To formally introduce our guest for today. Laura Dave is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of several novels, including The Last Thing He Told Me and 800 Grapes. Her novels have been translated into 38 languages, and 6 of them, including The Night We Lost Him, have been optioned for film and television. She resides in Santa Monica, California. Again, welcome. How are you today? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I am deep in it. I'm on my new book, and so it is so nice to sort of come up for air. And there's nothing I love more. Libraries and bookstores are tied in my heart as my favorite places to be. So it's such a lovely way to get to spend the day and end the year by talking with you today.
Absolutely, you're in good company. Lovers of libraries here, all
Yes.
of us. So you said you're deep in it with your new book, meaning you're coming up for air from a book that you're working on now?
Yes, I'm actually writing the sequel to The Last Thing He Told Me, which will be coming out in probably January of next year, January 2026. So
okay.
I am finishing that final draft and hoping to turn it in by Christmas. We'll see.
So I guess kind of jumping into media questions, though, then wasn't The Last Thing He Told Me season 2 supposed to come out in the fall 2025? Is that still happening?
So actually it's sort of wild. So the show is filming right now, and the show will come out after the book comes out. So It will probably be, if the book comes out in January, it will probably come out in March or April. So basically, I sat down with the showrunner of the show and I walked him through. I have a draft of the book already. I've been working on it for over a year. And I walked him through, like, these are sort of the big moves of how the book's going to work and everything else. And I gave him the first 100 pages, and then he goes off and he's working on the show while I'm working on the book. So it's sort of wild. So they're filming the show right now while I'm putting the finishing touches on the book.
The characters are literally coming to life before it's been put in the world.
It's wild. It's sort of been a very wild timeline.
So in the past, you've had, well, especially for The Last Thing He Told Me, right? You wrote the script for that. So it's kind of the same then for season 2. Mm-hmm. And then for The Night We Lost Him, this book just came out and it's already being worked on for a film. Are you heavily involved in that as well?
Yes, so we're really involved with the film of The Night We Lost Him, which is going to be on Netflix. My husband and I are actually writing that together, which has been very, very fun. My #1 love is writing novels, and I would say that I really like writing a screenplay for a movie as opposed to television, because it's a similar process of sort of isolation and you're alone doing it. And I'm very excited for The Night We Lost Him to have its second life.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that too. Even reading the book, you can totally envision it being a movie pretty easily. Do you ever write with that in mind, with it in mind, especially now that you've optioned 6 of your novels that these might become film or TV series?
I really don't, because I think that it's such a different thing.
Okay.
When I'm sort of writing a book, the way that it works for me is it all starts with character, and it all starts with sort of a question that I have for the main character to sort of plumb and figure out, sort of the emotional landscape of what she is grappling with. And that for me is sort of a very intimate exercise in getting her to a place where she becomes the hero of her own life.
Mm-hmm.
And that might take on, I never know what's going to happen for her. And that might take on a road that might lead her down a road that wouldn't necessarily lend itself to a movie or to television. So I really do try not to, I very naturally don't think about that until after. And then I'll sit down and think, okay, what is this character's journey, and how would it look different in a second life that would be more amenable to TV and film?
Okay. Did you work in TV and film before writing books?
I did not. I shouldn't say that. I had an internship one summer when I was 20 years old. I worked for Robert Zemeckis's production company at DreamWorks, at Image Movers. And I was at school in Pennsylvania, but I came out here for the summer for that internship. And I realized very, very quickly, I had this idea in my head that I would be working on movies during the day and I could write at night. I thought they would sort of be copacetic. And actually, I realized very, very quickly that the demands that go into the movie business and that whole world, it was something that was going to make it impossible for me to write. So I had a very short-lived movie experience of that summer. And then I was like, peace out. I have to figure out another way to be able to write books, which was really what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. So that makes me wonder about kind of your journey as an author and a writer. And Megan from Salina Public Library is saying, what made you want to be an author?
Well, I love that question. For me, I was a reader first, and I loved reading. And I remember very clearly as a young child, my father coming home from work and reading to me every night. And the magic I found in books and in storytelling, that's where it all started for me. And from a very young age, reading and storytelling was my primary love. And I remember around third grade, I decided I wanted to write and try to tell stories myself. And I came home one day and I said to my mother, I'm going to write a novel this afternoon, which made her so happy because I'd be busy, until dinner time. And really, I really never wavered from that. From that early age, from 10 years old, I always wanted to write books and write stories, short stories, all of it, poems. I just love the magic of the experience that happens only between a writer and a reader, that conversation.
So what was your third grade book?
It's so funny. I remember it was so bad. It was called The Runaway Cruise, and it was about a young girl whose parents decide to go on a cruise without her, and she stowaways. She becomes a stowaway in on this cruise ship, and she gets kidnapped, and it's a whole thing. So, but
sounds exhilarating.
But I've really been writing since then. And I've had a bunch of teachers that understood how serious I was about it and really encouraged that. And that made a huge difference even early on.
I love that story. I kind of feel like you need to write a reprised novel of.
Yeah.
Okay, so your new book, The Night We Lost Him. Can you give us an introduction to that? I know, a lot of people come to the event not having read it yet. So if you could give us an introduction to The Night We Lost Him, that would be great.
Absolutely. So The Night We Lost Him focuses on Nora Noone, who is a neuroarchitect, which is a certain kind of architect that really focuses on building structures and buildings that hold you, that help you heal emotionally and physically, which is sort of this new movement within architecture. And she's quite successful, and she's doing very well, and she's self-made, and estranged really from her father, who at an early age separated from her mother and went on to have two other families. And she's separated from the siblings that are the result of those unions, until he dies unexpectedly. He falls off a cliff near his home in Carpinteria, California. And the authorities rule the death accidental. And Nora is going on with her life until her estranged brother shows up and says, I think that Dad's death is actually more nefarious than we're being led to believe, which leads Nora and her brother on this journey to figure out what actually happened to their father. And in the course of this exploration, she realizes that she didn't really know the man who raised her and who she thought she knew. And she didn't really know the secret that was at the center of his life, that when it unravels, changes everything about Nora's life in the process.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm thinking about that theme of secrets,
Yes.
family secrets in particular, kind of, the consuming nature of these secrets. It tends to be something that that you do a lot, and I love it. So what
Yeah.
is it about secrets and family secrets in particular that intrigues you?
I'm always interested in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how we're interacting in the world. And as much as I am interested in the secrets we keep from each other, most interested in the secrets that we keep from ourselves to keep that narrative going. And something that really is moving through this book, the same way it moved through the last thing he told me, is this idea of what we are unwilling to see about our own lives, and what happens when we pull the lid back and look at that from a new angle, what that reveals to us, not only about ourselves, but about the people closest to us. And I think that there's so much narrative interest where that unveiling occurs. So that's sort of what sparks for me. I think all stories really begin with the unveiling of a secret one way or another. And I like moving through that to get a character to a different place. There's this quote by Gloria Steinem that I heard almost 2 decades ago now that's had a huge influence on my writing life. And the quote is, how important it is for women to watch other women become the hero of their lives. And I extrapolate out from that to think about having my main character really become the hero of her life. And how is a secret going to generate that kind of heroism?
Mm-hmm. I love that. So was that the central question then when you started writing this book? So Lisa from Dare County Library says, how did you come up with the idea for writing this particular story?
So for this story, the question at the center of it was, what does it mean to be the witness to someone's life?
Okay.
And what happened, the secondary question that sort of arose as I was working on the book was, and what happens when the person who is the witness to your life is taken from you? And those two things juxtaposed together became the question that every character in this book was asking and answering for him and herself in a different way. When I'm writing, I never know what's going to happen. I'm not an author who outlines or who has the ending in mind when I sit down. I often think of the E.L. Doctorow quote that writing a novel is like driving at night. You only have to see as far out as your headlights. And I think about novel writing as, I know what's happening in the next 20 pages. I know what's happening in the next emotional transaction that's moving my character along. But for me, it's that sense of discovery, that sense of answering those questions if I get to be surprised, hopefully the reader gets to be surprised as well.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned what neuroarchitecture was, and that Nora
Yes.
is a neuroarchitect. Why was it important that she was a neuroarchitect for this story?
I think because I didn't know anything about neuroarchitecture when I entered into working on this book.
Hmm.
And I thought I was making something up. I thought I was inventing sort of a discipline within architecture. I had a friend who talked about who knows a lot about architecture, who talked about this idea of how important it is for a room to hold you, that you can sort of feel it when you're in a space that is nurturing. I think that books are the most nurturing thing. I love your bookshelves behind you. And I think part of it is that they hold us, they make us feel comforted when we're in a certain room. That's one of the reasons libraries feel so amazing. And I love thinking about her looking at the world in that way, because I thought it would give her a window into understanding who killed her father, because she's looking at it holistically in a way that other people might not be. And as I was doing this research into architecture, I stumbled upon the field of neuroarchitecture, which really is, at its simplest, how can a space hold you? How can it make you feel more physically and emotionally held than when you walked in there in the first time? And I stopped writing and I started doing all sorts of research into this discipline and how powerful it can be when you are in a space. For example, neuroarchitects are working to create memory care units. So if somebody is starting to lose their memory, that they have dementia, Alzheimer's, what you can do to create a space that helps them hold on to the memory they have and helps them be comforted in their daily life. And I thought, what a gift to be that kind of architect, and what that would say about Nora.
Yeah, you definitely introduced me to something new that
Yes.
I kind of went down a rabbit hole with. I'd never
Mm.
heard of architecture before, ever, which isn't surprising. It's not like I'm an architecture expert, but
Yes.
so
No, but me either. And I love like design and I love all of that, but I hadn't heard about it. I think for these characters, for Nora in The Night We Lost Him, for Hannah and the last thing he told me, because I'm really the most interested in how normal people can find themselves in a situation where they have to be extraordinary. I like to give them a very specific window in which they view the world. Hannah as a wood turner, it's a similar thing. How is she viewing the world in a specific way that's going to give her the tools she needs when she's thrust into this extraordinary situation?
Mm-hmm. Now, did you take some wood turning classes for that character? For
So,
Hannah?
what's interesting about that is I did not take any wood turning classes, though I did shadow a couple of wood turners and speak to several wood turners in depth about what they did. Jennifer Garner, who plays Hannah Hall in the show, she did learn how to wood turn.
Oh, that's
So it was really amazing. And in the show, when she is doing wood turning, it is actually her doing it.
that's really cool.
Excuse me.
It's a nice little fun fact. Okay,
Yeah.
so back to The Night We Lost Him.
Yes.
Abigail is saying the sibling dynamics in the book are interesting and not what we think of as ordinary dynamics.
Yes.
Can you talk about that and why you decided to have these siblings live similar but separate lives?
So I've always been fascinated by the idea of how a sibling relationship influences everything in our life. And I spoke with a psychologist who said that even if two siblings grow up in the same home with the same set of parents, they're growing up with different parents. And I thought that was so interesting. This idea that who the parents are for a first sibling versus who a parent is for their second child, third child, so on and so forth. They're different parents because it's at different moments in their life with different financial, they have different, financial obligations, different, all sorts of things. Maybe they're young when they have that first child and older with that second in a significant way. And I thought, well, how do I turn up the volume on that? And how do I create two siblings who, because even if you are in that same home, then you have an imperfect understanding of how you're growing up. You think that you should understand this person perfectly because you're growing up in the same place, and yet there's so much often friction between you and your sibling. And how do I turn the volume up on that? And I thought, well, let's put them in different homes with one of the same parents, but they understand that person quite differently, and with all the things that go on with that. And then I wanted to see that relationship grow into what it can be, because as different as you might feel from your sibling, they are the person in so many ways that is going to walk through this life with you. And so I wanted them to find their way toward each other.
That adds an interesting dynamic then, because Sam has a twin brother and they did grow up together, but they seem to have different takes on their father.
Exactly. Because I think that often everything about how you're parented is so specific to who you are that even as a twin, you're walking through that similar dynamic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Corey is asking, are any of the facts based on your own life or siblings?
Well, I love that there's a Corey in here, because Corey's so important to the book. You know, I don't tend to write in an autobiographical way. What I do think is similar is it's often a question that I'm really interested in terms of my own life. You know, I love this idea that there can be someone in your life who is a really true witness and reminds you of yourself and reminds you who you've always been, regardless of how you evolve over a lifetime. And sometimes that's a romantic partner, and sometimes that's a friend, and sometimes that's a sibling. But what a gift to have someone walk the length of your life with you. And what a responsibility if you're that person for someone. And so whereas the biographical details of my characters are not really, they don't really match up with what's going on in my life, that questioning is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And what I do have in common with Nora in this book is I lost my I love those balloons that just came through. I lost my parents in sort of a close succession to each other. And so this idea of how we can think about grief in different ways and think about it not as something to fear, but as a continuing of a conversation of love was something that I was exploring while I was working on this book.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because talking about those themes of grief and love, we already covered secrets. I know you said that, you know, it's not kind of autobiographical, but you did an astounding job of portraying grief and what happens when you lose someone that you love. Even if the relationship had its ups and downs, like Nora and Liam's did, you really highlight all of these layers of grief. So as a reader, it makes me think, were you going through something personally or channeling something personal when you were writing this?
Well, I certainly was, you know, in the aftermath of the loss of my parents. And so that was definitely an element of what I was thinking about while I was working on this. My parents, you know, I mentioned that my dad would read to me every night, and my parents were my first readers and my closest friends. And I think the gravity of no longer having them in the everyday sense is something that I certainly was grappling with. I think also, you know, I read somewhere about this idea of grief before I lost them that really stuck with me and was something I wanted to explore in writing. And I just alluded to it when I talked about grief being the continuing of a conversation of love. But I saw someone interviewed talking about who had lost their child, which of course is unimaginable for all of us with children. But what this woman was saying was that when she feels the grief overtake her, she welcomes it. And she welcomes it because she thinks of it as a visiting of love. And that's the love continuing. And that was, I saw that interview before I lost my parents, but that has always stuck with me as such an extraordinary way to think about grief. You know, this idea that it's love's continuation. And so that was something I wanted to infuse in this book, to not make it something that was sad only, but rather something that you can turn grief and think about it as Nora learns more about her father and the aftermath of his life than she knew when he was alive. So in some ways they're closer. And I love that idea.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And grief being a continuation of love, still very, very challenging to go through. And Jane Ann from Helen Kate Furness Free Library is saying, what was the most challenging part to write? And what was the most rewarding or exciting, part of the story to write?
Well, I love that question. I always wanted to write a love story that took place over 50 years, that took place over a lifetime. And that was that really the witness, being the witness to someone's life. And so that was the story in this book of Corey and Liam. And that was my favorite part of the book to write. I actually have about 200 pages of Corey and Liam that didn't even make it into the book because it wasn't the pieces of them that needed to be there are in the book, and then the rest. But I just loved writing that story, especially because I had a teacher in grad school who talked about this idea that all books are really a love letter to one person, which is really how I've approached writing over all 7 books that I've written, and now I'm working on my 8th. And I just love that idea. I think it's so incredibly powerful. So my favorite element to write was that love story, and also the idea that this is really a love letter that Nora is writing to her father, which that element of the book was my favorite. I think the hardest element in the book to write, I am not, I often get classified as a mystery writer or a thriller writer, but I never write thrillers or mysteries that are rooted in the traditional mechanisms that you see in those books, revenge and violence. And I love reading those books, but I'm not particularly interested in sort of mustache twirly villains in any way. Yeah. And so, Liam is killed in this book, which you find out in the first couple of pages, but really writing who kills him and why was probably the most challenging element, because I had to find sympathy for it to work for me. And figuring out a way for the children to forgive that man was both the most challenging, and also maybe, it was very rewarding as well.
And you said that you never have things planned out when you sit down to start writing. So when did you know who it was going to be that pushed him off the cliff?
I knew early on that Corey and Liam's love story was going to hold the secret to the mystery. But I didn't know until I was deep into the draft who did it. In fact, I thought it was going to be someone else in their life who did it. And then when I realized that, just to be clear, once I get through that draft and I have that revelation, it's not like I turn the book into my editor. Then I have many, many drafts after that in which I work out, okay, so I think this is what happened. How do I fit everything together? And I go back in and I do another draft and another draft. For The Night We Lost Him, I wrote 18 drafts before I turned it in.
Oh, so how do you keep that all organized?
I really, so I think of it almost like each draft then becomes its own, like each character gets a pass through the novel from that character's point of view. How am I honoring that character and what they would say if it was their story? And that's sort of how I think about each draft, so that I can go back in and feel like I honored Sam, I honored Corey, I honored all these people who on the page we're going to be seeing mostly through Nora and Liam's point of view. But if this were their telling of it, did I make sure to honor how they would want their story to be told?
Mm-hmm. So you said you always wanted to write this kind of
Yes.
50-year love story,
Yes.
but was this the book that you knew it was going to happen, or did that happen organically as you started writing?
That happened organically as I started writing.
Okay.
I knew that Liam and Corey's story was going to be important, but I didn't know that. I didn't know. I started with that first 50 years ago, 51 years ago flashback, but I didn't know if that was going to end up working or if I was going to end up pulling it. I didn't know how important it was going to end up being.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the idea, same time next year is a play and a movie that I loved. I love getting to visit people over a period of time and seeing the way that relationship has morphed, and how it, we can hold space for things that aren't at the center of our life necessarily, but become so central to our own life.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and that, and, and the cost of it, because, I read years ago about Katharine Hepburn's long-term affair that she had, and that was so central to her life. And I was so fascinated about it. I think right behind me, I have the biography about her somewhere. I won't bother trying to find it in this chaos that are my bookshelves. But I thought, oh my goodness, this is so interesting to think about, that this beautiful, dynamic actress had such a quiet and unrealized love affair at the center of her life. And that was also something that was really inspiring to me as I thought about Corey and Liam.
Mm-hmm. So, but that's not the only love story in the book.
No,
The
certainly not.
longest.
Yes.
And Jesse is saying both Nora and Sam have their own love stories and this element of the one who got away. And
Yes.
is that right?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And I think that for all of them, they are grappling with that question of who gets to be the witness to their life and who they have to let go in order to honor the person that they want to witness their life for. And I think that's always an interesting question when we're juxtaposing the mystery of who someone is. We have to take a strong look at who they let in, and because of who they're letting in, who they're keeping out. And ironically, what we have here is three different love stories, a triangulation of Nora's love story, Sam's love story, and Liam's love story. And when everyone there is having to make a choice about who they're going to love and who they're going to be because of that love.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said that you have some 200 pages of
Yes.
Corey and Liam, and Fatima from Calgary Public Library is asking, what does the editing process look like? So were those 200 pages cut in editing, or did you cut those before they went to the editor? What does that editing process look like?
I cut those way before. Actually, my editor doesn't usually see anything until I'm very far along. I have something on my computer called the garbage file, which would terrify anybody. But the garbage file is enormous. And what it really is I think that what makes us writers and good storytellers, hopefully, is as much what we're willing to throw away as what we're willing to keep. And early on, I realized that just because I loved writing something doesn't mean that it belongs in a certain story. And I'll put it to the side. I had a whole novel called The Fifth Beatles Wife that lives in the garbage file. And the only thing that survived from The Fifth Beatles Wife is the prologue of that book, which is the prologue of The Last Thing He Told Me. I believe strongly that things come back. And if we put something in the garbage file, it will find its way into the world in another way if it's meant to. So those 200 pages live in the garbage file. No one has seen them. And some of that story might make its way into another book at another time.
Mm-hmm. Now, was there anything taken out of the garbage file for the sequel in The Last Thing He Told Me?
Yes.
Or then the prologue?
Excuse me. Yes. In fact, so much of the sequel is when I went back in, writing The Last Thing He Told Me took me about a decade on and off. I wrote 2 other books in the process of finding my way to the final version of that book. And Owen had a whole section of that of the original The Last Thing He Told Me. About 30,000 words were from Owen's point of view. And those all went into the garbage file. And I would say about 10,000 of those words have found their way into the sequel and how I'm telling that story.
Okay.
Most notably, the original ending of The Last Thing He Told Me, I was holding on to it strongly for years because I thought the book was going to end in a certain way. And really finding my way to how The Last Thing He Told Me ended meant letting go of that original ending. And that original ending is really how the sequel ends.
Wow. Okay.
So
there was a reason you were holding on to it for so long.
There was a reason I was holding on to it. It just took 2 books to get there.
Yeah. Is that, so you said you on and off for 10 years you worked on that. Is that the longest of any of your novels that you've worked on? The Last Thing You Told Me?
Yes, that is the longest. I couldn't seem to let it go, but I think it really was the primal story of someone becoming a mother. I think that's at the heart of that book. And I started working on it in 2011, and it wasn't until I had my child in 2016 that I realized that was the primal story I was trying to tell. So of those 90,000 words that existed in that first book, 70,000 went to the garbage file. And I started again after my son was born, and I found my way to the end.
Okay. So Adelaide is asking, your novels tend to take place in small towns, but with the last 2, there are also touch points of bigger cities, in particular flashbacks to New York City. At some point, one of the characters has lived or does live in New York City. Can you talk a bit about why you chose to set your novels in these picturesque locations with a backdrop of a bigger city?
Well, I love that question. I think that where a character lives can really infuse who that character becomes. And for me, I've always been interested in towns that are on the edge of the world in some way, because I think it requires something different of its inhabitants. And narratively, that's a place I always want to lean into. So in The Last Thing He Told Me, that was Sausalito. In The Night We Lost Him, Carpinteria. These towns on the edge of the world that really influence how those characters go about living their life. And what draws them there becomes a huge factor, and trying to get back there becomes a huge factor. So I'm always, I think, going to have my characters on the edge of a world in some way. A small spoiler for the sequel is that it takes place in a small town in another country, a large piece of it. And I'm always drawn to that because I want them to have to deal with that extra layer of both anonymity and sort of the way that you are in a small town, both more anonymous and yet everyone knows you. It's this amazing thing that happens. And I think New York is just such a touchstone for me. I was born there and I grew up outside New York City. And it's always, even though I've lived in Los Angeles now for more than a decade, when I land in New York, I'm home again. And so I just sort of think about New York often, and it becomes a place that I naturally go back to narratively.
And having a personal connection there, it probably is easier to write about too. Do you travel to all of these small towns that you put in your books?
Always. So I'm a huge researcher. I do so much more research than even ends up in the books. And one thing that I do, most of my books take place over short periods of time. And I'll often go and do the research before I start the book. But something I do that's a little specific and strange is when I'm near the end of the writing process, I will go and have the exact march, if you will, that my characters have over the course of those days. So I'll go to Carpinteria and I'll start the book exactly as it starts, and I'll fly to New York. I will literally check the math of every place the characters are in the book and make sure that any liberties I'm taking are not an error, but a choice.
That's amazing. So it makes me then start thinking about all of my favorite things that you have in the book, food and wine and hotels. So are some of those places real then? If you're doing that march, are they real? Are you really going to restaurants that you've put in the book, or are they based on real places?
Almost always.
Oh, that's amazing.
Almost always. And in the back of the books, I'll acknowledge some of the places that were helpful and that I'm basing things on or that had an influence in some way. But they're almost always real places.
Mm-hmm. So that makes me think about the hotel industry then, because that's basically like a second character almost in The Night We Lost Him. I definitely found myself Googling every few minutes. I'm like, wait, what's that place? I want to see if I can find something.
Yes.
So how did you learn so much about that industry as a business? Because you ran the gamut of boutique to large.
Yeah, so I did. I mean, it's so funny. I'm looking behind me and I have the Bill Marriott biography behind me. So I just do a ton of research. And you know, what's so lovely is so many people are happy and excited to talk to novelists. At least that's been my experience. And I'll shadow, I shadowed several people who worked in the hotel industry. In the back of the book, you can see that I spent time at several hotels that I recognize that were particularly helpful to me. And then I imagine from there. I sort of feel this way about it, that if I was going to write about a dentist and I didn't do any research, what do we think about when we think about dentists? Cavities, right? That'd be the first thing that any of us probably think about. But if you go spend time with a dentist, then you might realize like how their artistry works and how they put crowns in and all this stuff that I might not even put in a book if I am writing about a dentist, but I want to have the opportunity to use those details because I think it makes for more interesting storytelling. And here it was such lovely research to get to go to visit these boutique hotels all over the world and spend time there and understand everything that goes into making a boutique hotel work. It was joyful research.
Yeah, that's really amazing. We have had a couple of people ask about your covers. Catherine from Midland Public Library and Jan, who submitted a question live, says, who designs your covers? The cover and font style on your novels is very similar. Can you please discuss that choice and how involved you are in the decision?
So the last thing he told me when that book came out, that's my favorite cover probably. And I really like this cover as well for The Night We Lost Him. When that came out, it's all through the publisher. They have a design team there. But that was sort of the first cover of mine that I really connected to, those houseboats. I just loved it. And after that book came out and it was sort of met with such a lovely reception, the publishers went back and they rebranded all the other books to feel similarly with similar font and a sort of a similar moody, romantic feel to the different books, which I very much like. And yeah, that sort of was what the branding was based on, was the last thing he told me.
Oh, okay. Well, it's definitely, you pick up any of your books now and without even looking at your name, you know it's a Laura Dave book.
Well, I love that because I love how they realize that. I cannot take too much credit for it, except saying, oh, I really like that one.
Make them all like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So Arlene from Snow Isle Libraries is saying, do you use your chapter length to regulate pacing or keep them similar and steady throughout?
So I love that question. No one's ever asked me that before. That's such an interesting question. So something that I think the reason my chapters tend to be short, and usually because, as I was mentioning with the E.L. Doctorow quote, I only know what's happening in that chapter. So it almost becomes a way that I'm in conversation. Each chapter I think about as a conversation I'm having with my characters that is propelling me on to the next chapter. But I feel such a responsibility to my readers and such a gratitude to every reader. I love getting notes from readers that they, especially when they say something like, I didn't want to put this book down and I couldn't, and I finished the chapter and I had to go to the next one. And I try very hard to create that experience when I'm writing, that each chapter feels like almost a drop of like joy or a drop of candy that then you want to keep going to what's next. I don't regulate, to answer the question, I don't regulate how much in an active way the length of each chapter, but I do have a strong sort of instinctual experience of where a chapter should end and where the next one should begin.
Okay. I once read in another interview that you listen to the same song on repeat while writing.
I do, which is this wild thing. So I listen to the same song for the entirety of a book, and then I move on with each book to a new song. And for me, it becomes like a meditative, I don't even hear it anymore, like background. This is where the book, it's almost like the soundtrack to how I'm writing the book.
What song was it for this book, The Night We Lost?
It was a song by Noone, You're Gonna Go Far, which I imagined as Liam saying to his children from wherever, from the great beyond.
And will these songs make it into the soundtrack for the film, or did they make it into the soundtrack for the series?
So for the series, it was there was a Bruce Springsteen song when I was writing The Last Thing He Told Me called If I Should Fall Behind, but it was a live version of that song. And it actually did not end up in the series, but sort of as an homage to Bruce Springsteen, a different song ended up in the series.
Okay.
And we'll see about the Noone song, I guess.
I guess we will. Okay, so you mentioned that you don't know how things are going to end up when you start writing. Pam from Everett Roll Marshfield Public Library says, I love your novels, both the unique plots and the great characters. Which comes first to you, the idea for the character or the plot?
Always the character. It always starts for me with the character facing something that she didn't ever imagine would enter into her life in some sort of very surprising way. And it starts for me there. And with that question of where she is going to go, I find my way into the plot.
Sherry from Anythink Libraries wants to know, have you ever scared yourself while creating a story?
Yes, I certainly have found myself, and it's so funny that you asked that, because Sherry, because right now in writing the sequel, it's probably my most sort of pulse pounding book that I've written, and I had a nightmare last night about something that was happening in the book. So I guess I do get a little bit scared. I want my characters start to feel very real to me, and I want them all to be okay, even when I know some of them can't be.
Do any of the characters really stick with you even after? I mean, maybe that's why you're writing a sequel, even after you finished writing the book.
They all do in some way, and I imagine them all living in the same universe somewhere, running into each other. They all stick with me, and I feel in obligation to be very truthful to how I think they would be living their lives, even if it's narratively inconvenient.
Yeah. Justine from Detroit Public Library saying, so often the husband or ex-husband has been the villain in the recent mysteries that I've read. Do you think that's a new trend, and why do you think that is?
So I've noticed that as well. I think that, and I really wanted to move, I actively wanted to move away from that. The one thing I knew when I wrote The Last Thing He Told Me is, though, even though Owen made bad decisions, that the husband made bad decisions, I wanted my character at the center of that to be right, that she was right to love him, that she was right to trust in him, even if it became complicated to do so. I think this idea of the husband being a villain, or that the main character was wrong to trust in the person closest to her. You know, I understand why the trend exists, because it's narratively interesting, right? They have to then overcome something. But for me, the very nature of wanting someone to be her own hero, I like the idea that she starts from a place of not being wronged, but rather being right. And loving the people closest to her was a choice that she was correct to make. And now the heroism comes in having to create something new on the other side of that. So I don't know necessarily if it's a trend, but it is. I mean, it's certainly all over the place. It's not, and I like reading those books. It's just not something that, you know, I think about Gone Girl. I think about all these books that do that so effectively. I think it's because there's so much narrative interest there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. We've had a lot of people asking about your writing process. I know that you said you don't, again, you don't sit down with the end in mind, but what does that process look like for you? Katie from North Canton Public Library says, can you describe your writing process from idea to completion? And Patty from Rowan Public Library is adding, do you have regular hours for writing?
Yes to both. Meaning, so every book has sort of looked the same. Interestingly enough, my first book I actually wrote during graduate school, and then I moved back to New York. I spilled water on my computer and I lost the entire thing.
Oh my gosh.
So in that moment, though, I think I actually, and I know that this could be me finding a silver lining, but I think in that moment I actually became a writer, because it actually didn't occur to me that there'd be something else I would do. I was just going to make this work. And so making it work looked to me like this, because then I didn't have the cushy comfort of graduate school to, you know, and a fellowship there. I wrote every morning from about 6 to 11. And then I went and had a whole variety of jobs to support myself and my writing life. I was a private school tutor, and I worked at ESPN, and I worked in publicity at the Speedo showroom. I mean, I had the craziest jobs, anything and everything to protect those morning hours. And that's sort of how I do it now still. I write every morning as soon as I get up, no looking at the internet, no responding to business emails. My mornings are for writing, and I treasure that time. I have my cup of coffee and I just get right into it. The song is on and I write my words. I don't have a word count, but I sort of know instinctually when I should be done, when it's going to be diminished returns. And that's when I stop and start returning emails and the rest of it on a day like today, because it's early in California. When I know I'm going to be talking to you, I get up even earlier. So I make sure that I get my morning writing in before I do anything else. And that has always been how I do it, each and every book, as though I'm going to have all those jobs I have to get to in the afternoon.
Well, what brought you to LA?
My husband's a screenwriter, and I moved out here for him, and yeah, that's where we are now.
Susan is following up on your writing every day from 6 to 11. Susan from Orange County Library System says, okay, so the obvious question is then, how do you avoid those distractions?
It's hard. I had on my old computer software called Freedom, which lets you just shut everything down. I don't have that anymore. Now I just sort of, so it looks a little different now because I have a child and I have to get him to school and everything. But for me, I just know that everything goes better in the rest of my life if I write first thing. And I love writing. I know I have a lot of writer friends who say, like, I love having written, but the actual writing is challenging. For me, that's the best part. And so, and I feel so incredibly lucky and grateful that I get to do it, that even on the days I don't feel like it, I manage to tap into the gratitude that, like, I get to. And I sort of just view it in that way. And I just sit and I do it. And of course, there are some days when I can't. And now most weekends I can't. But 5 days a week, that's where you'll find me.
Okay. That's amazing. Alan from Cuyahoga County Public Library is saying, what were or are some of your influences that create inspiration for you?
Well, music plays a huge role. Actually, I love reading plays. That is often something that has an influence. In this book, In the Night We Lost Him, I actually mentioned some plays that have influenced me. The Real Thing by Tom Stoppard is a play that I often come back to because I love the sound of the dialogue in these plays. And I think reading plays can keep your dialogue strong and thoughtful. This book here, Heartburn by Nora Ephron, I reread every fall. She has had a huge influence on how I approach writing. Two books for any people that want to write that have a huge influence on me: Bird by Anne Lamott and On Writing by Stephen King. I love both of those books, and I return to them often as a source of writing inspiration. I love Joan Didion. She has a huge influence on my writing life. And really reading in general. I have a day book and a night book at all times. So my day book is something that might be helping with my work. Like if I like something like the Bill Marriott book on hotel writing, or Empire of Pain had a influence on this book because I thought about the Sackler family a lot. And Sackler was one of the, even though he's nefarious, I like looking at these men who sort of ran empires to understand Liam better. And then I have a night book, which is sort of my escape book. And I return to that often at the end of a day as the reward.
So what is that right now?
Right now I'm reading a book by Jennifer Smith, actually, who's a novelist who I love. It's her book that's not out yet, but so I forget, All's Fun in the Family or something like that. I just started it actually last night.
What is a book that is out that you've read recently that you think everybody should run out to the library and check out immediately?
I loved a book called The Last One at the Wedding. Jason something was the writer. Oh, here it is. And I love this book by him as well. See, I just have them all sitting right here for this moment. Jason Rekulak. I really like his books very, very much. I think people should go and get that at the library. I can look right behind myself at books I've read recently. This book I thought was wonderful.
Colored Television.
Yes. I think she's a great writer. I recommend heading out to get that book as well. And then this book was pretty joyful for me as well.
That's just a great title as well.
It's a great title.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've had several people ask about any advice that you have on people who are looking to start writing or have been writing and seem to be stuck. Just any general advice that you have for the writers out there.
So I have sort of two pieces of advice that I like to give. One is that your habit is everything. And a lot of people have full-time jobs, full families, full lives. So that habit does not have to look like you sit down every day. But even if it's 2 hours a week that you give to yourself, make sure that you're loyal to that habit, because even if you feel stuck, if you're loyal to that habit, eventually you'll get unstuck. Writers write. So you have to sit down, butt in chair, and try to do the work, whatever that habit looks like. I mentioned those two books, Bird by Bird and On Writing. You can read those, and I think that they can often offer help. Another book that I love is called The Weekend Novelist. I read that when I was writing my first novel. I found it to be very helpful. I would definitely read those books, but for the hours that you're sitting there, whatever your habit looks like, give yourself a word count. Maybe it's 500 words, maybe it's 1,000 words, but if you stay loyal to that, then eventually you're going to get to the end of a manuscript. People recommend Scrivener and some other software. I've never used any of that, but I know some writers find it useful. And that leads me to my second piece of advice, which is I understand how much that because I felt that as well. You want to feel like at the end of the road, you're going to be published. And I understand that. As much as possible, I recommend staying away from thinking about publishing until you have got into a draft of a book that you are really, really excited to share. Because you often have one shot with an agent, with an editor, and you don't want to rush it. So after you finish a book, put it away for a little bit. After you've managed to get to the end of a draft, put it away for a little bit, go on with your life, and then look at it again with fresh eyes and go back in, which that's my second piece of advice. When you think you're done, you're probably not. Give yourself time to get to the draft that you are sure you have done everything you can, and then step into the waters of how do I get this published.
Amazing advice. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly been a pleasure to talk to you for the last hour.
Oh, it's been so much fun. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a lovely holiday season.
Absolutely. I want to echo that. I extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in. Without your support, none of this would be possible. And we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, if you scroll below the live stream video, you'll see a resources area, and that area contains a link to Laura's new book, The Night We Lost Him. We look forward to seeing you all again in 2025. I'm Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us.